Hi, welcome to the DRH show where I have wide-ranging conversations with fascinating people. We talk about all things psychology, mental health, and wellness. Today, I'm joined by a PhD researcher from Edge Hill University, Christopher Leech. Thanks for joining me.
Hello, Dennis. Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for joining me here, Chris, and lovely to have you here. If you could just share to us your background, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Okay, so background. Where to start really? So my obviously I'm doing the PhD now. My undergraduate degree was in forensic psychology and criminal justice. Went on to do a health psychology master's. Both of those were in John Moores University up here in Liverpool, and then sort of here to the PhD. More broadly speaking, I'm from Liverpool. I'm a person with albinism. Visually impaired, legally blind, severely sight impaired, sort of any of those sorts of things. Academically speaking, I wasn't necessarily a, shall we say, high-flying student in school. In college, I actually did media. I was really interested in being a film director at one point, and then it sounds really daft, but I actually was just reading about like psychology for fun. A couple of TV shows really influenced me, being Frasier and In Treatment, and a little bit of House as well, but that's not necessarily psychology. But I remember sort of watching those sort of shows and then picking up a Freud, the Key Ideas, real sort of like bare bones kind of book, and going, this psychology business is really interesting. This sort of thinking about why people do things, so it was quite nice, and then that inspired me to want to study it further. I had a slight interest in law, and then forensic psychology, criminal justice. We were in the money there, really.
Now, Chris, you have quite a non-linear trajectory when it comes to your research journey. So earlier you mentioned that you did a bit about health psychology, and also you also did something about media. So what made you decide to choose your particular research topic? Is this also a funded PhD?
So the PhD is funded. So I'm a GTA, or graduate teaching assistant, up here at Edge Hill. So I had to sort of apply through sort of like what we would define as like a more common like job application process. I had to apply, submit a proposal. I spoke to Dr. Linda Kay, who's my director of studies, absolutely amazing person. Check her out if you haven't. About the idea and say, would they be interested in this and supervising this? But honestly, the big switch for me, and it's a really daft story, but I remember very clearly my college tutor sitting us down and saying, okay, the UCAS deadline is in like 3 weeks. You'll need to have your UCAS application done, dusted, sorted. And I remember going home and having a 3-hour conversation with my mother, who's a lovely woman, inspiration, and like going, I don't know what I want to do. I don't want to do media. It sounds daft to say, I think now, being much older, but sort of going, I really don't like media. You can be crap at what you do, but if you know the producer and you know the person who's giving the jobs out, you'll get a job on set. And I didn't like that. I was like, I'm a much more a what you know person. I'm all about like knowledge and that sort of thing. Because I mean, if you're watching this, I'm a nerdy guy, right? So it was very sort of like, oh yeah, I'm not sure about this. What else could I do? What could I go and study at university? What am I interested in? What do I think that I can go away and do? And a big part of that was, well, I'm interested in what people do. That's sort of what we call psychology. Are there courses for that? Yeah, of course there are. I also had an interest in law. So that's where the forensic psychology, criminal justice kind of married in together, because that sort of interest in the justice system and that whole sort of dynamic was really sort of pivotal to me picking the course. It was my first choice. It was definitely what I wanted to do. And I was really fortunate and, like to get a place on that and then go straight into there.
Now, Chris, so you're doing a research within cyberpsychology. Now, if we're going to compare cyberpsychology with more established subfields within psychology, say for instance clinical psychology, we can say that cyberpsychology is just an emerging field. So it might seem straightforward for you, but for the uninitiated, what would you say is the real world application of cyberpsychology?
Oh, well, I mean, that's a great question. Firstly, let me point that out. Within the psychology field, cyber psychology is new. It's a blossoming, but it's really about looking at the psychological impact of our digital interactions. I mean, this podcast is digital; we're taking place online. the entire sort of digital world is it's a unique sphere, you know. So my PhD is looking at video games and mental health and that interaction. Side note, you know, there's very little sort of on that, which is why I'm doing the PhD research. But just within like the whole cyber psychology field, it's so new, and we don't, you know, we can make more colloquial assertions like, you know, oh yeah, people play video games or people watch Twitch and stuff. But as psychologists, as researchers, we don't necessarily have a lot of science in that area, and that's where these sort of emergence has come from. As we've become a more technologically dependent, I guess I would say, like, you know, society and people, you know, it's become the new thing. It's kind of the hot topic in psychology. So it is just really looking at that direct link of what is the impact of digital things upon us as people, and how do people interact with digital things.
I'd like to touch upon what you said about something about colloquialism within the area of cyber psychology. Do you think it's a problem, or do you think it's kind of democratizing the access to knowledge?
I don't know. I mean, it's difficult because for me personally, you know, I'm very much like open science. I'm very much that research should not be held in this ivory tower. It should be shared. But I think one of the things that makes cyber psychology accessible is that quite often we're talking about things that all people are using. Like, who isn't on the internet, you know, these days? I mean, internet poverty and things like that, let's put that to one side. But on a very general sort of discussion, a lot of people are connected online. A lot of people are on things like social media. A lot of people use the internet as a primary research tool, for better or for worse. So I think it really adds the application of people understand exactly what we're talking about more, and understand the applications that we're sort of relating to, and then that makes it more accessible. I also think a lot of people who are in the field and, you know, sort of pushing things forward are very into making this knowledge just like very, very easy to disseminate and make sure that people can understand it and access it.
And would you say that for you to be an effective cyber psychology researcher, do you have to be a sort of an online creator to be, you know, like, I would hesitate to give this explanation, but pretty much like for you to be a gynecologist, you have to be a woman for you to be able to totally understand the female anatomy. Would that be the same with cyber psychology? That you have to, you know, kind of be active all the time with the internet, or for you to be an effective video games researcher, you have to have at least an understanding of video games, or just a basic understanding of research. What's your take on that?
Honestly, I mean, the gynecology example is quite like funny because I think particularly the medical profession, it's very sort of male dominated. Maybe, I mean, I don't have any data to back that up. It's maybe an opinion. But with cyber psychology, I think being a good researcher is important because that's how you research things, right? Does me being a nerd, a gamer, help me research video games? Yes. However, I don't think it's like a necessity, because I think you can maybe get a sense of objectivity, and maybe being that one step removed can be actually quite helpful. Yes and no, really. I mean, am I passionate about it? Yes. Is that going to help me go through the research journey? Yes. Does it give me knowledge? Yes, of course it does. However, I think you don't have to be a 100-hour-a-week gamer to want to do some research on like Animal Crossing. Do you know what I mean? And I think that is a big distinction. It's and the other side of this is that so much of like what we do is digitally connected, right? Like, you know, so many people own phones, so many people are online, that even on like a base level, so many people are going to be connected to the cyber world anyway.
Like what you've said, cyber psychology is such an exciting, blossoming field. So can you give us some exciting trends within video games research? What's the latest development?
Well, the sort of latest research specifically, I think, is the stuff being that was done by the Oxford Internet Institute of Research. I've probably said that the wrong way around. But back in January, they published a study about Animal Crossing's New Horizons. And it was Plants vs. Zombies, and found that the playing of video games actually had a positive impact on well-being. And that was like a big thing. The big thing within that, I think, was that the companies involved, Nintendo and EA, actually provided the data. That was a big thing. Everyone was like, video games and positive well-being. What on earth? Whereas I was like, they gave them the data. What? That's a bit of a joke within the field. I think the thing there in video games, we are very caught up in the cyclical nature of moral panics. Oh, video games, they're bad for us. They think of the children, as a quote comes to mind. And you get this kind of cycle of, that we know through history of people sort of in power, sort of maybe politicians get involved and say, oh, this new thing, in this case, video games, we're very scared of it. We don't understand it properly. We'll pay some people to do some research. Those people then maybe find associations with, in the classic debate, video games and violence. This sort of becomes publicly canonical. People kind of accept it as general knowledge. It's only sort of within the past, well, I mean, where are we, 2021 now? Within the past sort of 5-10 years, we've actually realized that is not the case. And, for those that don't know, the replication crisis in psychology, like a good experiment, yourself listening at home should now be able to go away and do this experiment, and you would find theoretically similar, if not the same thing. That is a good experiment. You should be able to replicate it and find results. We've had kind of suffered the replication crisis, whereby we're actually going through some of these video games and aggression studies and finding that not to be the case, and finding some, issues with the methodology or the methods used. So a classic example for you is to measure video games and violence, you would get one group of people to play, say, FIFA, one group of people to play Grand Theft Auto, two very popular franchises in the video game world. I'm sure you've heard of them, at least sort of within the ether. And you get people to play them, and then after playing the game, you say, okay, the next person that's coming in, they're going to eat some of this food, pour hot sauce on it. And this is a legit thing they've done in experiments. The amount of hot sauce that you put on the food apparently represents the amount of aggression that you might feel. Now, if you're listening to this, you might think, that's wild. You're not wrong, because it is wild. But this kind of happened, and people just kind of went, video games and aggression, yep, that makes sense to me. I might just really like hot sauce. I'm just, I'll bang it on. Why not? Because I enjoy hot sauce. I enjoy spicy food. The person that comes in, whether, like, obviously they didn't necessarily get the food. The idea was that the more hot sauce you put on, the more aggressive you are. Is that methodologically sound? I don't know. Further to that, there's this kind of, idea that, so for me, between playing Grand Theft Auto and FIFA is the kind of game that would get me really mad. And not because of, not aggressive. I mean, what do we even mean by aggressive? That's a problem. Pardon me. But I find a game like FIFA much more annoying and frustrating, which would maybe lead me to be more after playing the game. So there's this sort of mistranslation of, well, actually, what if it's not the content of the game, but say frustration or difficulty level? And these kind of things, historically have not been included. So going forward, there's this. So, sorry, to go back to your actual question, you have to kind of give that background. A lot of people are, pardon me, a lot of people are caught up in, okay, let's actually find out if this is the case. The most recent research is kind of finding that it's not the case. The Oxford study I mentioned before is actually saying, maybe, video games being the root of all evil is not the case. So while everyone is kind of going left and sort of, looking at the replication crisis and finding, null effects or negative effects, I think the next few steps, and it's kind of the path I'm on, is saying, okay, well, what other impacts are there? Games are so vast and so varied and so wide. What other impacts are there? And in my instance, I'm looking at video games and mental health. So you kind of have to have all that background in there to understand where we're kind of going, if that makes sense.
Now, as what you've said, Chris, there are actually methodological lapses when it comes to, I suppose, that stereotypical notion that playing video games causes aggressive behavior. But could you just give us some of the benefits of playing video games based from your own research?
Very broadly speaking, I mean, people have looked at video games and hand-eye coordination. I think there's a huge area in video games and social connection. I mean, You think about the pandemic, you think about how many people were connecting online. Video games have always been multiplayer, and like my own sort of personal like life. I've had an online game night with one of my friends for several years now. Every night we get together, we jump on a video call and we play some games, and it's a great way to socially connect. So it's really varied. Like the whole space is so wide in that, when you kind of look at it, there are so many different perspectives you can take. There are also like visual acuity sort of researchers that look at, well, actually video games help train hand-eye coordination and things like this. So there's definitely a whole different areas. I mean, there's some research that looks at the different impact of avatars, using games in learning and educational spaces, how impactful they are, and that kind of research is burgeoning. It's kind of still very early. There's not like the greatest amount of these kind of things, but they are developing.
Now, Chris, I apologize if you already addressed this earlier, but what are you trying to achieve with your PhD? Are you trying to develop an intervention tool using video games as a way of promoting mental health? Is that what you're trying to achieve?
Well, this is where it gets a bit interesting, because in truth, like, yes and no. Could video games be used in some way? Well, we don't actually know if video games have any impact at all. So what I'm actually looking at really is centered around what happens if people play video games, say, centered around mental health. Does that impact their knowledge on mental health? Does that change their perceptions of people experiencing ill mental health? So I think to develop an intervention, I think, is the future. I think that's a couple of steps ahead, but we need to try and look if there is any effect at all. There is a legitimate chance that there might be a null effect, and it could be, if you go down maybe the Christopher Ferguson kind of route, that actually just playing video games has very little impact on us at all, period. Is that my personal opinion? I don't know. I think I've had many an emotional response to games, and I think I've learned a lot from games. So this is like the big issue, right? In that there is not a lot of research, if any, that has actually looked at what happens to us when we play games, whether we like absorb knowledge or this shapes our opinions. You can say, well, colloquially, in the culture, yes, because it feeds into multiple opinions, and by reinforcing stereotypes that exist, or by trying to change stereotypes, you're sort of putting those things in the ether, if that makes sense. And this is why it's really important to, in a very scientific and experimental way, try and test these things and see if there is a change over time.
But how would you...
Sorry, I was just going to say, we don't really know.
All right. But I was just going to ask you, but how will you strike the balance? Because also there are the different sources there that would say that when we spend so much time on the screen, screen time also have detrimental effects to mental health. So how would you strike that balance? You're trying to promote positive mental health, but at the same time, you're also using a tool which could potentially have detrimental effects in mental health. So how do you strike that balance?
Screen time is a really interesting sort of term, and I think it's very loaded. I think we kind of view it very negatively. I think you often kind of see it bundled in with social media, and again, the research is very kind of conflicted. I think it was the Oxford Institute for Internet Research that also found that there was no significant impact to well-being or a negative correlation. And correlation doesn't equal causation. Just because these two things maybe change doesn't mean that they're related between social media use. So screen time within of itself is a very broad term. I don't know about yourself, but I mean, particularly over the past sort of 18 months, sort of getting towards 2 years now, I've spent a lot of time on a screen. I've, worked from home, 9 till 5. And then I remember very vividly, I would finish work at 5, close on my work-based applications, and then open up a game. So, I'd still be spending a lot of time at the screen, but what I was doing was very different. And I think it's about what we are doing. Like, what you're doing is more important than the fact that you're engaging with the screen. Because I think, again, like the digital spaces are there, everyone working from home or working, in many environments, you are doing sort of screen related stuff. I mean, people have screens everywhere, right? I've got a Fitbit, it's a screen. I've got a phone, it's a screen. So it's kind of complicated and a bit loaded. It kind of relates to the moral panic thing that I was talking about before, in that, screen time has become a very, bundled in term. People are kind of tossing it about. From what I'm aware of, it's still very debated, very sort of open to interpretation. But I mean, I think to assume that anything is all bad or good, like screen time, like it's what you're engaging with that I think is more important. And that's why with my research, I'm saying, okay, well, if we're looking at specifically a game that is centered around, say, mental health in this case, does that have an impact with someone, with their experience playing the game, as opposed to somebody who's playing a game that isn't about mental health, and then sort of comparing those differences? That's one of the designs. As you say, I mean, you could maybe look at screen time and say, well, if someone has spent all day on the computer, then do that. That's definitely something you could maybe sort of consider. But I feel like screens are just inescapable, right? Like, how many houses have a screen in every room,
Absolutely. Well, Chris, I've been a content creator for probably close to 15 years now, so I can definitely say that probably I have exceeded the allowed screen time even before the pandemic. My life pretty much revolves in front of my laptops and my smartphones. Yeah, so I really agree with what you said, that perhaps it's not really how long you're spending in front of a screen, but actually what you do with it. So let's say, for instance, that you're probably spending most of your time watching pornography, or you're reading some extremist materials. That will be more problematic compared to, as let's say you're spending your screen time doing something productive. Say, for instance, running a podcast, which brings us to your podcast. So tell us about your podcast.
Oh, well, thank you. That's a nice lead in. You mentioned that you've been a content creator for a long time. I'm very new to the field. I like to call it my non-work time. I'm very reticent to use the term spare time. I'm sure you'll agree with me, Dennis, and that when you are content creating, no time is spare. So I stream on Twitch weekly. I'm lucky enough to be affiliated, be an ambassador for mental health charity Take This over in the US, and a champion for UK-based charity Safe in Our World. So my sort of streaming content is related to, we play games, we have fun, but there's always this is an open space to talk about mental health. I'm very happy to talk about my own experiences. It's, I'm not a therapist. It's a very sort of wax lyrical kind of, this is where you can have a discussion. And then sort of from that, I was really like, it's 2021, who doesn't have a podcast? Am I right? But I was like, there are so many great people in the video game studies sphere, just awesome people that I know. And I was like, I really want to sit them down and talk about what they do and why they do it. And when they're not doing that, it really is sort of, it sounds a bit cliche, but like those real people stories, The podcast is called Psyched to Be With You. We're sort of closing the first season very soon. It's been a bit of a whirlwind, but it is just talking to these people about what they do and why. And we've had some really great discussions. I can definitely attest that content creation is a lot of work. You are looking at a lot of screens, and I appreciate, the effort you've gone to here, Dennis, and you're having me on the podcast as well. There's a lot going on there, but for me, it's just, I'm very nosy. The basis was, I'd love to chat to some of these people about what they do, and people are receptive to that. And I like hearing about what people get up to with their work and, maybe their research or their job and what they do when they're not doing that. It's just fun, I guess.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the most memorable episodes?
Oh, I mean, we've had a really wicked first season. I mean, the most recent episode we've done was with a streamer friend of mine, Marco, or Solid Snake, as he's known online. And just talking about like being a mod in an active Twitch community is something that I almost had very little appreciation for. There was the episode before that with Oxan Boch was great, who's looking at ethics and AI. We had a bit of a great discussion about like ethics in robotics and choices in games, but also we touched on sex robots. It wasn't a very blue conversation, but it was very illuminating. yeah, just I spoke to a small business owner, Rachel Button, in episode I think 4 that was, who owns one of my favorite little board game cafes, and just hearing that perspective of what it's like to own a business and manage that, and having gone through COVID and stuff, really great moments. I actually had Dr. Linda Kay on the show speaking about her new book. One of the big memorable, I think, things from the season was that during that episode, I always like to invite guests to ask me a question towards the end of the episode, and she actually asked me, I can't remember the exact word, but it was like, what can video games tell us about humanity? And I was like, wow, I wasn't prepared for that, and just tried to knock out an answer at the end of this episode. So it's very sort of passive from my end. It is about just giving people the opportunity to tell me about themselves and what they do. And I don't know, I really enjoy it. I hope other people do. But at the very least, that it feeds that kind of nosiness.
Now, Chris, as what you said earlier, it's already 2021, so virtually everyone has a podcast or some platforms of some sort. But from a researcher point of view, because it's very easy to create a content, everyone can do it. You're just using a smartphone, but to create an engaging content, that's far more different. That's far more difficult. So do you have any tips from a research point of view? What makes an engaging online content?
I mean, that's a great question. I would say I'm not necessarily equipped to answer it, in that I don't know if my content's any good. Like, maybe it's me just being self-deprecating and being like, oh, I'm not sure. But I think the reason I think it's important is that content creation allows a great way to disseminate information and create community and provide discussion, right? Obviously, again, like, I'm existing in a mental health space that is about being able to talk about things, about promoting discussion, and about ultimately challenging stigmatization. I think as a researcher, it's great to have like an additional platform and a way to, talk about things. Like, I'm also, and I know it relates to what you do yourself, Dennis, and I'm a bit of a blogger. All my blogs kind of live on like my Patreon site, all for free. Nothing lives behind a paywall. I don't believe in that. Support if you want to support, early access maybe at the most, but side note. But it's just about having a place to produce content. Whether it's good or not, I think ultimately is up to you as a viewer, a listener, a reader. But I think for me, it's about being, genuine. Ultimately, there's always going to be an element of, being parasocial. When I'm in front of a camera, just like this, I'm always going to be performing more than I am maybe in, my offline life. But making engaging content, I think, is just being able to make stuff like snappy and interesting, like make people watch it, like include things like captions and graphics. And I mean, again, I'm saying this, I'm not an expert. I don't know. I've routinely contacted other people who are much more long in the tooth than this, including yourself, Dennis, and sought their advice and information and guidance. But for me, I think it is just about being in the space and really being unafraid to be yourself and be honest and engage with that, and be bold. Like, I have a very unique kind of thing. My sort of selling point is I call my show Blind Psyche, very playfully, because personality, legally blind, etc. And I study psychology. So, like that's my USP. I like to talk about things from a psychology point of view. I like to talk about accessibility. I like to talk about mental health. There you go. If people resonate with that, great. If not, fair.
Yeah, that's a very good point, that you have to identify what USP is, your unique selling point, so that you can genuinely connect with your audience. And another thing that I want to hear from you in relation to that question is that what about the length of a content? Because they say that you have to consider, the attention span, because they say, for instance, when you're writing a blog post longer than 1,000 words, and you're fighting against your reader's attention. And they also say that when I was starting my podcast, I was a bit ambivalent whether to do it like half an hour or an hour. I was not sure about that. So for anyone who's watching this, they probably noticed that I'm quite inconsistent with the length of my interview. So what would you say is the ideal time frame? Say, for instance, for a podcast, because you host a podcast, would it be more engaging, if you have a comprehensive interview, or would it be rather short and snappy?
Well, I'm going to confess here, I'm not a professional at this. I am very broad in my applications. I mean, with a podcast specifically, I've had episodes that like run just over an hour. I've had episodes that have hit nearly 2, because at the end of the day, if I'm having a great conversation, it's a great conversation. I think when from a psychology point of view, we're both psychologists, like you're looking at attention span and stuff. I also think of the way that I engage with like podcasts as a listener. Like at the end of the day, if something I'm enjoying it and I enjoy the voices and what's being said, I'm just going to listen to it, whether that's in multiple chunks or like, if I'm going to listen to a whole podcast episode while I walk the dog or whatever, like that is what it is. I'm a bit of maybe a rebel, maybe just not good at making content, in that I just kind of let it be. Like, maybe that's because I haven't dived into the analytics enough. I think the other side of it is that maybe that makes me a bit lazy on that, is that being a Twitch streamer, you stream maybe for several hours in one go, and that can sound like quite a lot. And, I'm one of those people where I export my content to YouTube, and, that's that. But there's I don't say a market for, but like, I'm one of those people, again, myself, like I like to have a Let's Play on a YouTube, just a playlist, someone playing a game, and I can have it on and listen to it, enjoy those parasocial sort of relationships, enjoy someone going through a game and having those reactions to a game. And that can be like hours and hours and hours of content, right? It's almost just like a very passive thing, but the fact that there is that amount of content is almost comforting within of itself. So honestly, you are probably better off having much more fixed, like a 40-minute to an hour podcast, and look at the whole boom with like TikTok related content, very short, snappy, easily digestible. If I was being cynical, and I am a bit of a cynical old man, I think it's maybe a bit insulting to your audience to say you maybe don't have the attention span for this. Relating to blogging specifically, I am, to quote Stephen Fry quoting someone else, what someone would say in 10 words, I would say in 100. I do that so much, and I am awful for it. The blog posts I've written are absolutely enormous, and I'm talking like several thousand words, because I'm just very wordy and I like to go on about things, maybe not quite as much as Tolkien or anything like that, but definitely a lot of words. But I think it's about what you're saying, and for me, the stuff that I've written that I think is the most important and the most impactful is maybe longer, but that's counterbalanced by the actual worth of what I'm saying. It's not just like, oh well, I'll add an extra 500 words talking about a tree. If it's there, it's there for a reason.
And when you write, do you usually write in a conversational tone, or is it more academic? Because usually I tend to have a problem with this, because I'm a PhD student, but my writing style is usually I write the way I think. And so that's not the kind of writing style you favor in the academic setting. I don't really write, like moreover, furthermore. It doesn't come natural to me. So sometimes when I go over my PhD, it comes across as forced. But what's your writing style when you write a blog post, for instance, which brings me to the fact that you actually wrote an article for The Psychologist. So tell us about what you wrote for The Psychologist, which is the publication of the British Psychological Society, and what's your kind of writing style?
Writing style generally, I think, is maybe overly conversational. I, like yourself, I definitely write as I speak. For better or for worse, but because I'm a bit of a nerd, pushes glasses up nose, I do kind of use words like furthermore and and such like that, because I enjoy words in English. You could maybe describe it as pretentious, and people have, I would like to think, maybe lovingly pretentious. That's just me. It's a quirk, I guess. Take that as it is. So blog posting is definitely like it's straight from the heart. It is just, as if I was saying this, as if it was conversational. Academically, like I may be good at compartmentalizing it and switching it on, maybe because I'm a bit, what you might say is wordsy. it's easier to kind of move dynamically between the two. However, I suppose the counterbalance to that is that I haven't necessarily written much that is academic for blog purposes. I mean, I've done maybe some like reviews and stuff where I'm being very critical and saying, okay, well, the positives were and the negatives were and the conclusion is, and it maybe has that aesthetic feel of an essay. Relating to the psychologist article, which I'm obviously very flattered you brought up, it was a review of Gaming and Me, Social Connections. It was a documentary that aired at the top of the year on BBC Three, available on BBC iPlayer. And it was about the stories of a few people and their gaming experiences and how much it meant to them. A good sort of like, I don't know, the way the thread kind of fell for me particularly was one of the interviewees, Joe Donnelly, is a writer and wrote a very excellent book called Checkpoint, which is about video games and mental health. You know, watching that, I was able to review it. And then I ended, I got a copy of the book. I read that. I've reviewed that. And like, the kind of, through watching the documentary, me able to review it. When you're reviewing something, you kind of have to always write it in a sense that the person reading it may never engage with the material. Like, they might not do. So you have to have enough in there that they get an idea and maybe is a little bit enticing, but not so little that they're like, it sounded pretty basic or pretty straightforward. So yeah.
Yeah, I tend to hesitate writing a review because sometimes when you write a review, you tend to, go on the trap that you're just saying all the positive things about the book or the film, and it's quite difficult to kind of be really objective about it. So usually we just end up reading reviews which are not so critical, not so objective about it. But what I'll do is I'll pop in the link to your article on the psychologist. So for anyone who's interested about it, they can have a read. Now, aside from being a PhD student and also a content creator, I understand that you're also the SciPag representative for the cyber psychology section. So for those who are not familiar about it, can you tell us what SciPag is and what is the BPS cyber psychology section?
Yeah, sure. So SciPag is the Psychology Postgraduate Advisory Group. So it's essentially the collective of the psychology sort of postgraduates across the UK. And it is about sort of having that connectedness. A lot of stuff is said about being on a postgraduate journey, be that a master's, an MRes, a PhD, and how sort of isolating it can be. You're kind of going down this route of you're looking at a very individual thing that maybe has not been looked at before or researched before, and how challenging that can be. I think add on top of that the past sort of 18 months, 2 years, okay, big questions there, but it's a group of connectedness. I actually found out about the group through the previous cyber psychology rep, Danielle, whose surname escapes me at the moment. I apologize. Because she was hosting an online coffee morning, and that was sort of like a get together on Teams and have a chat, meet other people in the field. And that's what led me to the thing. Being a rep, you had to submit an application. There was a vote and all things like this at the annual conference. It was honestly like a privilege and a pleasure to be elected. The application felt very last minute to me, and it was like, okay, I'll apply for the sake of it. I'm a guy doing nerdy things. Honestly, like at that point, adjusting to the PhD role and stuff was still very fresh to me. The BPS cyber psychology section, the BPS is the British Psychological Society. It sort of governs all of psychology in Britain. It looks over the degree programs and all sorts of things like this, as well as being a hub for where groups of people get together and discuss research and policy, and that is divided by section or division depending on the area. So you have like one for clinical psychology, as Dennis mentioned before, and this one has cyber psychology. So the emphasis of being a student rep for that section is that you're able to connect with other students in the field, but also bring their views to the committee in a hope of sort of shaping the section and the sort of overarching kind of ideals and sort of views of cyber psychology to include that voice. I'm very passionate. Sorry, I keep moving my hair. It's absolutely all over the shop. I'm very, very passionate about people having a voice, particularly from groups that maybe are not often heard. As I mentioned, cyber-psychology is new, but also I think, the students, they're the people on the ground all over the country learning this, and they're going to be, it sounds very cliche, but they're going to be the future of the field, right? There's going to be a point where the people on the current committee step down or leave or retire or whatever, and then the people that are currently studying are going to be the people that take their places. So I think it's very important to now work together and form that sort of cohesive community to be able to drive the field forward in a sensible and scientifically respectable way, I guess. But also still from that student basis, particularly build like a community. We want to know that we're in this together, and even from a basic level of oh, you're studying like something similar to I am, that level of connectedness, is really, really important.
Absolutely. By the way, earlier you were referring to Daniel Potok. So, Daniel, if you're watching this, hi.
I'm sorry.
That's fine. So, earlier you said that there are challenges that comes with doing a PhD, and on the earlier part of this interview, you were alluding to that you have your own challenges. So, did you find that that sort of made it worse for you to do a PhD?
In what sense?
You said that you have visual impairment.
Oh yeah, so being a person with a disability, I mean, okay. I mean, how long have you got? I can really get stuck into ableism and academia, but let's not. So for me, I'm a person with a visual impairment, so things like reading takes me a lot longer. And yes, there are digital tools and things that allow me to make the playing field much more level. But ultimately, it's about half of it is like me as an individual training myself to operate in what is quintessentially an ableist world. And the other half is like, yes, using things like applications and tools that are available. A big thing that I'm very passionate about is that, persons with disabilities should have an equal opportunity. And why are things not put in place to allow those people to succeed, thrive in academic environments? It is a field with a bit of friction. It is still quite challenging. There is still a lot of issues and discussion, and networks like disabled students in higher education are in a big conversation about that. And it is about, again, like that sense of community and knowing that you're not the only person in that boat. It does have some very sort of practical limitations, like my eyes get tired quite easily, and as you can imagine, when you're reading as much as I am, it's not great. Even there's something almost laughable about a blind guy studying video games, right? Like, it's you would look at those two things and go, wait, what? Really? So a big part of what gets me up in the morning is proving that, like, yes, I can. But it's really difficult because I think I've always been visually impaired. I've always been a person with albinism, so I don't know any different, right? There are also obviously other people who maybe lose their sight and things like this, and they have to make an adaptive change, and they can maybe compare that to what they have had before. Disability is such a huge and open field and includes so many various different sort of disabilities and things like this. So there's always going to be like that. I always like to jokingly sort of put it. It's like playing the game on a slightly harder difficulty. Does that make sense? Like, we're all playing the same game, but I'm maybe like a slightly harder mode. And yeah, like, it doesn't mean I'm not capable. It means I should be given the same opportunities as everyone else. And through the use of maybe like additional technological means, or just even through like self-management and self-regulation, I'm able to do just as well as everyone else. It does make me a bit of an upstart. It does mean that's why I have all these side projects on, because I want to prove that people like me can, and hopefully inspire. But also there is a part of it that is about having conversations like this, right? And being open and talking about my challenges and saying, yeah, I do struggle with this and this is difficult, but people like me can as well.
I think many people can relate to that. One of the motivations for doing PhD is just to show that people that it's doable, it's achievable, and just to be a source of inspiration for those who probably been in the same situation, whether it's disability or be it socioeconomic class. But what's your plan after PhD? I suppose, can you give us like a snapshot of what's the career path for those who don't want to work within the academia?
In cyber psychology, I mean, I think one of the blessings about the route is that it's so varied. I mean, if academia isn't for you, which, yeah, I kind of understand why maybe it might not be. In my case, there is opportunity and potential to work within the video game industry, and help inform mental health related content, inform accessibility related content. I have legitimately thought about going back and doing some maybe game design stuff. I've talked about this very openly. I'm not a game designer. It's a very new world, but I'd love to get that knowledge and then be able to, approach companies like that. I think, because I was saying before, cyber psychology is so interconnected with what we do. There's a very real aspect of it. People like Dr. Linda Kay are doing these very open discussions and speaking to people in a very open and honest way and saying, these are how these things link. You don't necessarily have to go down that traditional academic route. There are routes in industry. I think we are beginning to see, well, I don't want to oversell it, but we are beginning to see knowledge that industry are acknowledging and saying, okay, actually, we need to manage data better. We need to collect data in a more ethically sound way. How can we use this that isn't just marketing? I mean, Dr. Celia Holden is an excellent psychologist who's spoken a lot about UX and UI, which is sort of user experience and user interfaces. And, sort of like how we develop these technologies and how they have an impact on our psychology, and sort of making those, in the future, looking at, well, okay, why can we not be involved in this process to make sure that things are doing what we want them to do, but also providing users with the best experience? Again, a lot is sort of said of, marketing and, the way ads can be a little bit, tricky, like that whole one. I don't know if you've ever encountered this, like you see a hair on an advert on your screen and it makes you want to flick it, and then you click on the advert and you get the ad. That's sort of a little bit naughty, shall we say. But all those sorts of things, like, they allow for the conversations of people like psychologists, like cyber psychologists, to get involved with industry and work with companies to make better products, right? And like to market it that way. Like, there are definitely so many routes. These are still new because the field is new, and maybe you kind of have to look at a job spec and they're very much sort of listing off things that really are a cyber psychologist. They just haven't said it by name, that maybe we as a field can be like, actually, no, this is, you want one of us, please use the appropriate title, I guess. But that gets into a whole lot more about, like, do you even use the phrase psychologist? Cyber psychologist is not currently a protected title and things like this, but very much semantics. I think if we're going to focus on like being a skill set, particularly in cyber psychology, there's so many avenues that you could go down, and that makes it really exciting as someone currently in the research field.
Do you have plans to work as an academic, or do you want to be a practitioner?
Oh, great question. Both, I guess, really. Like, the stuff that I want to research, I've like recently started teaching, and it's not bad. I feel like I resonate with people quite a lot, but I'm also enjoying, content creation stuff, and that's really fun, and I can still talk about the things that I want to talk about doing that. So, like, yes and no. Like, there's always more training to do, more learning. I'd love to go and, as I say, maybe learn game design and then work with maybe companies that way. I also maybe want to stay in academia and do research some really cool stuff. And maybe like one day I'd love to be maybe like a burgeoning group of like geek therapists, like go away and do some psychotherapeutic training, and you'll be able to incorporate things like video games and geek culture into that, because there's a call for that as these things sort of become more integrated with just our everyday culture, right? Like, there are some great people doing some great work in the US doing this type of thing, like, geek therapists, and I mentioned Take This and things like this. Like, there's a lot of scope, and it's kind of scary to not have a very defined path, which I feel like I had up to doing a PhD. Like, I knew I always wanted to do one, so I was like, okay, right, this is an academic path in the UK. You do undergraduate, you do masters, you do PhD. So yeah, it's to use a game metaphor, it becomes very open world. It's very non-linear after that point, and that's exciting but also scary. So we'll just kind of see what happens, and the people you meet and the connections you make, and that's the excitement, right?
Absolutely. Now, Chris, earlier you addressed the misconception that screen time is actually bad for mental health, and you also mentioned something about playing video games causes aggressive behavior. But can you name other misconceptions about cyberpsychology that you've come across and sort of address them?
I mean, okay, so I'm still very new to the field, right? So I'm not going to overstate claims that other people have researched and are way more knowledgeable on. But I mean, a topical example is social media. Think of the children is that sort of classic one. The facts are that we don't have the data to truly be able to examine these things in their entirety, right? Like, as I say, the Oxford Institute for Internet Research, or I'm probably saying that wrong, that is what it is, but they are producing the kind of research that actually says, well, we're not sure. Are these things really the way they are? Part of the problem is, I think, that you get this social synthesis of like ideas, and you go, okay, well, social media must be bad, and ultimately anything can be used maladaptively by an individual person or persons, right? We can't escape this. But I mean, so for, my own example, like, one of the things I like about Twitter, for example, is that you can completely curate what you see. Have I occasionally gone down a rabbit hole of looking at tweets and replies about things that are like necessarily not great, and then left it going, yeah, feels a bit rubbish, Yeah, of course I have, because it is the internet. But ultimately, like, I think having that introspection, that self-awareness of, okay, actually I can curate my timeline to be cat memes and wonderful researchers, is a different experience to everything and anything, right? I think added on to that, there's just so many. I mean, video games and aggression is a big one that it just doesn't hold true. Screen time in of itself is challenged because context is important. Social media, there's so many, and it's so vast. I think they're probably the triad of what we're sort of experiencing now in the social nexus, particularly again. And I don't want to keep time stamping this, but like, I think the impact of the pandemic has really made people look at this a lot more, particularly in screen time's case. I mean, people were on video calls and stuff, and Zoom fatigue became a thing in meetings and things like that. I don't know about you. I mean, I referenced it before. I keep playing with my hair. That's because I can see myself, and that makes me feel very conscious and very aware of it. You have all that sort of thing. You also have the nexus of Twitch and streaming, and the huge amount of people that went to that to feel a sense of social connectedness. They're probably the big ones, the big challenges. But I think, if you ever hear sort of this X is all bad, another topical example is that, insert game title is like crack for kids. Loot boxes is another big discussion in the gaming world. And the research is still coming out. Ultimately, we found links between, I think I read a couple of papers attesting to like a link between some gambling behaviors and use of loot boxes, but we don't know which direction that goes in. We don't know if someone is maybe more likely to engage in gambling behaviors will spend more on loot boxes, or spending more on loot boxes, leads to that type of behavior. And that's the age-old caveat of, say it with me, everyone, correlation doesn't equal causation. Just because we see maybe two things, correlate, it doesn't mean that we can say, yes, those two things definitely equal each other. And that's where, we need more research. Just pay us, give us the money to do this research, and then we can find out.
Absolutely. Now, Chris, you mentioned Dr. Linda Kay all throughout the conversation. So I was just wondering, aside from Dr. Linda Kay, are there any individuals who was the greatest influence to your work?
Oh, I mean, oof, how long have you got? There are so many great researchers. I mean, I've referenced them a few times, but take this: they have some incredible psychologists working there. Dr. Kelly Dunlap, Dr. Rachel Coa, Dr. Raphael Boccanoso, or Dr. B, for strange Italian name reasons, long Italian name reasons, as you would say. They're all people that I admire and respect in the gaming spaces as psychologists. As I say, Moral Combat by Patrick Mackey and Christopher Ferguson is an absolutely huge book about, that moral panic and misconception that video games and violence are linked. It's a great read. I would also say, from like a general sort of psychology kind of standpoint, I'm a big fan of Dr. Jessica Taylor, forensic psychologist, who is quote unquote a radical feminist, as she would describe. But yeah, I think like for me, like I'm sit there, if I was if you were sort of looking at people saying, I want to do what they're doing, I think, people like Dr. Linda Kay, people like Dr. Rachel Coa, people like Dr. Kelly Dunlap are up there in that game studies space and sort of the whole sort of content creation space as psychological researchers. I think they're the ones that I'm like, yeah, if I can be involved with what we're doing in a few years' time, I'll have made it.
Do you have a professional dream?
I'd love to make a game.
Mhm.
I'd love to make a game about about mental health and disability, and be able to have like a really interesting and engaging game as someone who plays games, but also be able to have these characters. I always say that I play a lot of role-playing games like Final Fantasy, for example. I was going to say it annoys me there isn't a blind character, because that's the exact type of game where you could have a blind character who can still cast magic and still be an active part of the story. But I'm asking a lot from an industry that has a lot of other issues. Representation of disability is not quite up on their tier list at the moment, because it's facing a lot of other scrutiny for other general representation. I'd love to be able to do that, but I think, funnily enough, someone actually sort of asked a similar question recently to me, and I said I would love to just be able to work with other people in the same field and really try and produce, whether it's research or content, something that is meaningful and really connects with people and helps change perspectives. And that is really around, representations of disability and mental health in the entire sphere. It's very bold, but I think if you don't dream big, right, why bother dreaming?
Absolutely. And Chris, what do you think you would be doing if you didn't become a PhD researcher? Would you have been a film director?
Oh, if I didn't go into psychology, well, I don't know. I mean, before the PhD, I was working in outreach. I was working in sort of educational outreach, sort of helping. It was on the data side. I always like to describe it as I wasn't doing the sexy part of the job. So I was part of a program that, would go out and sort of talk to people in sort of their school age, talk about their academic, opportunities and, potential. And so a lot of it was around like raising attainment, but also raising aspirations. And I was doing the data side for them, sort of a lot of data tracking, data entry. So I probably just wouldn't have left that. I think, even then, though, that was based on a foundation of psychology. Would I have carried on the media dream? I don't know. I think in a really daft way, I always kind of had this sort of tug for psychology anyway. I mentioned like TV shows like Frasier and In Treatment. Like I was consuming those as just someone who enjoyed media even before I realized psychology was properly a thing. So I really honestly don't know what I would have done. It's been too deep. Maybe I'd have just gone down, would have just stayed in the media route. I don't know. I always remember very vividly, actually, at a very young age, wanting to say, okay, well, I'll be a games designer, and people sort of telling me, oh, Chris, the people in those jobs, though, they've been in it for 30, 20 odd years. They're going to be in them for like another 50. And that was, 2008, 2010. And then the indie game scene happened. So everyone makes games, and we've had some absolutely amazing stories and titles from, one or two people individually, and not these massive juggernauts of capitalist studios, AAA, as we would call in the sphere. So maybe I'd have gone that way. That's a great question. I don't know. Maybe I've done nothing.
Okay. And finally, Chris, the floor is all yours. Tell us what else is in the pipeline. If people wanted to reach out to you, what platforms can they get in touch with you at? And remind us of your podcast.
The floor is mine. Well, yeah. So I'm Christopher Leech. I'm a first year, soon to be second year PhD student up at Edge Hill. I am looking at video games and mental health, particularly around the student population, because unfortunately the student population have particular emphasized challenges with mental health. If you want to find me, the best place is probably Twitter. I'm at Chris L Psych on there. That's where I post a lot of my ramblings and links to everything else. I've got like a link tree. As I say, I stream once a week. The notifications go on there. If I do a new thing with the podcast, Psyched to be with you, available wherever you find your podcasts. That's available there. Ultimately, I do it because it's fun and it's interesting and I enjoy doing it. There's no emphasis on like support. If just people turn up and enjoy the content and like leave, just enjoying it, I think is the main thing. If you want to leave a review or you want to support, there are options for that as well. But, ultimately, I'm doing this because I'm passionate about it. I want to be able to talk about these messages. As I say, I'm very privileged to work with and be an ambassador for two amazing charities who are fighting this good fight with me. And it is just about having fun and being open and having those connected conversations. And I also, share memes because memes are fun, right? It's been a real privilege and a pleasure to be here as a guest on a podcast, and the questions have been fantastic. It's definitely given me some food for thought. There's just so much going on and it's great, and there are lots of great people doing great things, and at the very least, if you connect with me, you'll see all those other wonderful people that I try and connect with myself.
Well, Christopher Leech, it's a pleasure having you here in the DRH show, but unfortunately time is against us. I look forward to hearing more about your work. Thank you.
Thank you very much.